Welcome to Education Decoded. In this channel, we uncover the stories behind the systems that shape our lives, the decisions that changed history, and the ideas shaping tomorrow. Today, we look into Kenya's education system and how it changed forever. Every Kenyan has had these numbers before: 7423, 844, CBC. They are more than just education systems. They represent different generations, different childhoods, and different ideas about what it means to be educated. Imagine being born in Kenya in 1960. You would have studied under one education system. If your child was born 20 years later, they would have studied under a completely different one. And today, your grandchild is studying in yet another system. So, in just a few generations, Kenya has completely reinvented education several times. But why? What was so broken that the country kept starting over? So many questions. But here's something most people never stop to ask. Why has Kenya changed its education system so many times? Was the previous one failing? Or was the country itself changing faster than its classrooms could keep up? So, how did we get here? To answer that question, we have to travel back more than a century to a time when education in Kenya wasn't designed to educate a nation, it was designed to serve an empire. Now, to understand why Kenya has changed its education system so many times, we first need to understand where that system came from. Because the story of education in Kenya didn't begin with independence. It began long before Kenya was even a country. In the 19th century, formal education was still unfamiliar to most communities living in what is now Kenya. Knowledge was passed from one generation to the next through everyday life. Children learned by observing, practicing, and participating in their communities. They were taught farming, herding, craftsmanship, leadership, conflict resolution, and cultural traditions. Education wasn't confined to a classroom, it was woven into daily life. But everything began to change as European missionaries arrived. Their mission was primarily religious, to spread Christianity. To read the Bible, however, people first had to learn to read. And so, churches began opening schools alongside their missions. As British colonial rule expanded in the early 20th century, education took on a much larger role. Schools were no longer just places for religious instructions. They became part of the colonial administration's vision for governing the territory. But there was one important detail. Not everyone received the same education. Colonial education was organized along racial lines. European children attended well-funded schools with modern facilities, experienced teachers, and academic curricula that prepared them for leadership and higher education. Asian communities, many of whom had settled in Kenya through trade and railway construction, generally had access to separate schools with better resources than most African schools, though opportunities still differed from those available to Europeans. African schools, by contrast, often had fewer resources, limited funding, and curricula that emphasized basic literacy, agriculture, manual skills, and vocational training. The goal wasn't simply to educate, it was to educate differently, according to the roles the colonial system had expected different communities to play. By the time Kenya was moving toward independence in the early 1960s, thousands of schools had been built across the country. More children than ever before had access to formal education. But the system they inherited had never been designed for an independent, democratic nation. It had been designed to serve a colonial administration. Kenya's leaders now faced an enormous challenge. They couldn't simply keep the old system. They needed an education that would unite a newly independent country, produce skills, professionals, and prepare citizens to build their own future. And so, almost immediately after independence in 1963, Kenya began its first major effort to redesign education from the ground up. That effort would become the country's first national education system, 7423. Kenya gained independence on December 12, 1963. The country was free, but one important question remained. What kind of education would build the Kenya that its people dreamed of? The education system inherited from the colonial government had expanded access to schooling, but it had never been designed to serve an independent African nation. It reflected colonial priorities, not Kenya's own aspirations. If education was going to help build a united, prosperous country, then it had to change. In came the Ominde Commission. Just months after independence, the government established the Kenya Education Commission, chaired by Professor Simeon Ominde. Its mission was clear: to redesign education for an independent Kenya. The commission believed schools should no longer divide people by race or prepare them for colonial administration. Instead, education should promote national unity, equal opportunity, economic development, and pride in Kenya's own identity. Following the Commission's recommendations, Kenya adopted what became known as the 7423 education system. Students spent 7 years in primary school, 4 years in lower secondary school, 2 years in upper secondary school, and 3 years at university. At the time, this represented a significant shift from colonial model. The goal wasn't simply to educate more children. It was to educate citizens who could help build a newly independent nation. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, education expanded rapidly. Communities came together to build schools through the Harambee movement. Parents contributed land, labor, and resources so that more children could attend school. Education became one of the country's greatest investments. Families believed it offered the best path out of poverty and into professional careers. For many young Kenyans, earning a place in secondary school or eventually at university became a dream worth working for. But as the years passed, new challenges began to emerge. Kenya's economy was changing. More students were completing schools than ever before. Yet, many struggled to find employment. Critics now argued that education system placed too much emphasis on academic learning while giving too little attention to practical and technical skills. Employers themselves increasingly wanted graduates who could solve real-world problems, work with their hands, and create their own opportunities. Many believed the education system was no longer meeting the country's changing needs. By the early 1980s, one question dominated the national conversation. Was Kenya's education system preparing students for the future or for a world that no longer existed? The government decided that another major reform was necessary. The result would become the most recognizable education system in Kenya's history, the 844. By the early 1980s, Kenya had made remarkable progress in expanding education. More children were attending school than ever before. But success had created a new challenge. Thousands of young people were graduating, yet many couldn't afford to find jobs. Employers complained that graduates had academic knowledge but lacked practical skills. The question facing the nation was no longer how do we educate more children? It had turned to how do we educate children for the real world? In 1981, President Daniel Arap Moi appointed a committee chaired by Professor Colin McKay. The committee examined education system and proposed one of the biggest reforms in country's history. Their findings were clear. Schools were producing graduates who excelled in examinations but lacked the practical skills needed for employment or self-reliance. Kenya needed an education system that prepared learners not just to pass exams, but to build careers, create businesses, and contribute to national development. In 1985, Kenya officially introduced the 844 education system. Students would now spend 8 years in primary school, 4 years in secondary school, and 4 years at university. But that did not make the reform revolutionary. It was the philosophy behind it. The government wanted every child to leave school with practical skills that could be used in everyday life. For the first time, schools placed greater emphasis on technical and vocational subjects. Students learn agriculture, home science, woodwork, metalwork, art and design, business education, and music. The idea was simple. If students couldn't immediately find employment, they should have the skills to create opportunities for themselves. Families welcomed the reform. Parents believed their children would graduate with skills that would change their lives. Teachers prepared for a new curriculum. Schools built workshops. Communities invested in equipment. There was optimism that education was finally becoming practical. But as the years passed, the dream began to collide with reality. Many schools lacked workshops. Others had no equipment. Some practical subjects became increasingly difficult to teach because schools simply didn't have the resources. As many subjects were added, students faced heavier workloads. Homework increased. Tuition classes became common. The pressure to perform in national examinations grew stronger every year. Over time, many critics argued that 844 had become something it was never meant to be. Instead of encouraging creativity, schools increasingly focused on passing examinations. Success became measured by grades, rankings, mean scores, and national exam results. For many students, education became less about learning and more about memorizing. The 844 system transformed education in Kenya. Millions of children passed through its classrooms. It produced doctors, engineers, teachers, entrepreneurs, and leaders. But by the early 2000s, another debate had begun. Had the system become too focused on examinations? Was it preparing young people for the 21st century? Once again, Kenya found itself asking a familiar question. Was it time for another education revolution? For more than 3 decades, The 844 education system shaped the lives of millions of Kenyans. It produced doctors, engineers, lawyers, teachers, entrepreneurs, public servants, and countless professionals who helped build the nation. But as the 21st century unfolded, the world was changing faster than ever before. Technology was transforming industries, automation was reshaping jobs, and employers were beginning to look for something more than good examination results. Today's employers weren't asking only what grades did you get. They were asking, can you solve problems? Can you think critically? Can you communicate effectively? Can you work in a team? Can you adapt to change? These were skills that traditional examinations struggled to measure. Over the years, education experts, teachers, parents, and policymakers raised several concerns about the education system, the 844. Some argued that students spend too much time memorizing information for exams. Others believed that the curriculum had become overloaded, leaving little room for creativity or independent thinking. Teachers often faced pressure to complete a wide syllabus while preparing learners for high-stakes national examinations. At the same time, parents voiced concerns about the growing emphasis on tuition and exams performance. These conversations sparked an important national debate. If education wasn't only about passing exams, then what should it be about? How could schools prepare children for careers that didn't yet exist? How could they nurture creativity, innovation, and problem solving alongside academic knowledge? These questions would eventually lead to one of the most ambitious education reforms in Kenya's history. In 2017, Kenya officially began implementing the Competency-Based Curriculum, commonly known as CBC. Unlike previous reforms, CBC aimed to shift the focus from learners remembering what they could do to what they could actually do. The curriculum emphasized practical competencies such as communication, collaboration, creativity, critical thinking, citizenship, digital literacy, self-efficacy, and learning to learn. The vision was ambitious: to develop learners who are not only knowledgeable, but also adaptable in a rapidly changing world. Every generation of Kenyans has experienced a different education system. Each reform was introduced with hope. Each promised to prepare learners for future, and each reflected the challenges of its time. But one question remains: has CBC achieved what previous reforms could not? Or is Kenya still searching for the perfect education system? That is the story we'll explore next.